Well, welcome to Sunday School on the Go from the First Baptist Church in Tallahassee. I'm Jim Glass, one of the teachers in the Pairs and Spares class, and I have the great privilege of guiding you through our study of the Old Testament books of Job and Ecclesiastes. In this quarter of study, we're discovering ways to apply the wisdom of the ages to our lives today and see how these messages from the Word of God point us to Jesus Christ. In our third lesson from the book of Job on this 20th day of June, we come to the 19th chapter of Job's story. Since we last heard from Job in chapter 14, his friends have renewed their attacks against their suffering friend. Eliphaz first tells him that his suffering is completely due to the fact that there is some unconfessed sin in his life, a charge that Job has steadfastly denied, and does so again in chapter 16, saying in verse 19, "Even now my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high." In chapter 17, Job renews his lament and pleads for relief, only to hear his friend Bildad renew his accusations of Job's sin, saying such things as, "The lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. The flame of his fire stops burning. The light in his tent becomes dark. The lamp beside him goes out." In verse 5. And in verse 12, calamity is hungry for him, disaster is ready for him when he falls. Concluding in verse 21 by telling poor Job, "Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man, such is the place of one who knows not God." It's no wonder that Job responds in the second verse of chapter 19 by telling his so-called friends, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me." Unfortunately, Job doesn't stop with complaining about his friends. He also lodges a serious complaint against God in verse 6. "Know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net. Like a hunter who entraps his prey, God has sprung an inescapable snare and bound him so tightly that he has nowhere to run." So Job claims in his confusion and frustration. Now at this point, Job may be as close as he ever was to actually cursing God. But remember, Job is speaking from his very limited perspective. He hasn't heard the conversation that God had with Satan. He doesn't know God intends to thwart Satan's efforts to make life so bad for Job that he will curse God. He doesn't see the larger picture. And neither do we when we're in the midst of the storms of our lives. So as you listen carefully to the intensity, the fury of Job's outburst in verses 7 through 20, remember that he's looking through a glass darkly, as Paul describes our sight in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He's trying his best to somehow make some sense of his situation and honestly, just desperately pleading his case before his friends and before God. In verse 7, we hear him say, "Though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no justice. He has blocked my way so I cannot pass. He has shrouded my paths in darkness. He has stripped me of my honor and removed the crown from my head. He tears me down on every side till I am gone. He uproots my hope like a tree. His anger burns against me. He counts me among his enemies. His troops advance in force. They build a siege ramp against me and encamp around my tent. He has alienated my brothers from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My kinsmen have gone away. My friends have forgotten me. My guests and my maidservants count me as a stranger. They look upon me as an alien. I summon my servant, but he does not answer. Though I beg him with my own mouth, my breath is offensive to my wife. I am loathsome to my own brothers. Even the little boys scorn me. When I appear, they ridicule me. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me. I am nothing but skin and bones. I have escaped with only the skin of my teeth. From Job to his relatives, to his wife, to his personal servant, to the kids in the neighborhood, even to his very best friends, everyone has abandoned him. There is no one he can turn to for help or comfort or relief. Everyone, including God, it seems, has turned against him. He cries out because of the wrong that he must endure. He cries out because of the violence he fears has been done against him by God, first of all, but the violence his so-called friends have brought it to him as well, as they persist in the idea that his pain and suffering were caused by some sin in his life. So Job tells them, instead of magnifying yourselves against me, setting yourselves up as critics and judges, overwhelming me with reproaches and filling my mind with pain and anguish, you ought to show me the sympathy of a friend. Because they weren't going through the same kind of troubles Job was experiencing, his friends had apparently assumed a tone of superiority and an authoritative manner that allowed them to sit in pious judgment over their friend, instead of showing the compassion that was rightly due to someone in such a terrible state. Unfortunately, some things never change. Even today, when we hear the plight of those who are experiencing pain or suffering or grief, how quick we are sometimes to look deep into their lives to see if we can't find some cause, some basis, some reason for their affliction, rather than just be there for them, uncritically, empathetically, not offering any quick fix or a solution, but just allowing the presence of God in our lives to be a source of comfort and assurance for them. That's why Job complains that his friends ought to show him compassion. Instead of trying to prove that he was an enemy of God, they ought to pity a man who was so strangely, mysteriously, and painfully afflicted, instead of increasing his sorrows by insisting that he was such a wretched sinner, deserving the worst of God's judgment. So many times, even without saying a word, your quiet, compassionate, godly presence can bring amazing hope to someone in the midst of the darkest moments that they are experiencing in life. Well, Job had cried out to God, but God had not answered him. All his piteous pleas for some explanation, any explanation, have gone unanswered. God had even fenced up his way. Every solution he imagined, every way out of his suffering had been blocked. He had been skipping happily along his joyous journey through life, abundantly and richly blessed, when the bottom fell out and everything came crashing down. Now, everywhere he looks for a way out is shrouded in darkness. There is no light at the end of the tunnel for Job. God has even stripped him of his glory and taken the crown from his head. Everything that had once contributed to his respectability and honor, property and health, family and friends, even his own dignity and self-esteem, God, he says, has taken away, and he is destroyed on every side. He feels that things are so bad, it seems like God regards him as his adversary and is treating him like an enemy. Things are so bad for Job that he says in verse 15, I'm an alien in my own house, and even his breath is strange and offensive to his wife. It's worthy to note here that in a society where it was probably not uncommon for a man to have several wives, Job only speaks of one, perhaps yet another indicator of his uprightness in the eyes of God. Even the children who were taught to respect their elders and may have even once had a high regard for Job himself, these very children make him an object of contempt and scorn, even when he stands in their presence. And it's not just by those outside his circle of personal influence that he's disrespected and dishonored by. In the first verse of our focal passage today, verse 19, we hear Job say, all my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I love have turned against me. those with whom he had shared his deepest secrets, those who had once been with him when they were rejoicing and celebrating the life God had blessed him with, those who perhaps celebrated the birth of his children or had grieved with him over the death of a parent, or maybe walked with him through a difficult time in his marriage. We all know people like that. There aren't many, but they've walked with us in our darkest and our brightest moments in life. And they're closer than family and sometimes even more precious to us. But even of these precious, intimate friends of mine, Job says, there is no one who shows any compassion to me. Instead, I'm the object of their rebuke. How can this possibly be? More than likely, it's because they, like Job's other friends that we read about in the book that bears his name, have reasoned that Job's suffering is due completely to his sin, and they want to have nothing to do with him, not only because of his sin, whatever it was, because also he refuses to acknowledge it. Job is in the throes of abject humiliation and abandonment on every side. He's rejected by all those who once loved him, forced to beg his servants to come to his aid, offensive to his wife, jeered at, even by children wherever he goes. It can't get any worse than this picture of absolute wretchedness, the lowest depth of despair we could ever imagine. He has no one he can turn to ease his heartbreak over a situation. If his severe treatment at the hand of God hadn't crushed his spirit enough, if his abandonment by his relatives and friends hadn't brought him to the very brink of despair, the pain caused by his disease completed the triad of hopelessness that's been forced upon him for reasons he hasn't been able to understand. The boils that have enshrouded his body from head to toe have caused unimaginable physical pain to his already broken and aching heart. So he says in verse 20, "My bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I've escaped by the skin of my teeth." His skin and muscle tissue had dried up so much that it seemed like the skin was just clinging to his skeleton, and you could count all his bones. Some scholars suggest that he had been infected by some form of elephantiasis, in which certain parts of the body swell to enormous proportions, while other limbs are emaciated, and, as Job describes, the bones seem to stick to the skin. Others say he was a victim of a particularly strong form of leprosy, and he has escaped by the skin of his teeth. As much as we might imagine this is a relatively recent proverb, the figure of speech seems to have existed in Job's day as well. It could mean that only the skin around his teeth, meaning the gums, were the only thing left intact, so that he could tell others his story. In fact, one scholarly commentator identifies a particular growth of ulcers in the mouth that destroys the gums and causes the offensive breath that Job told us about in verse 17. As this disease runs its course, the only skin that's left is the connective tissue that surrounds the roots of the teeth and attaches them to the bony socket in the jaw. This skin of the teeth is all that remains to allow Job to speak and, if Satan were to have his way, curse God. With these three sources of unimaginable suffering he's experienced identified and explained, the hand of God, the rejection of his friends, and the enormity of his physical suffering, Job cries out in verse 21, "Have mercy on me, have mercy on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. God has afflicted me and stripped me of every possible source of comfort, and I am left a poor, distressed, forsaken man. Since even God appears to have forsaken me, I plead with you, my friends, and beg you to show some pity for the awful situation I'm in. Please give me some word of hope or encouragement." Now, you would have thought that Job's tearful, miserable cry for help would have broken or at least touched the hearts of one of his friends, so that instead of their persistent words of judgment, he might hear some word of consolation, just one. But as we'll see in the very next chapter, as soon as Job finishes his confession of steadfast faith, Zophar lays into him again with his sermon on the righteous judgment of the wicked. But Job pleads for someone, anyone, to speak just one word of compassion to him. He says that the hand of God has touched him, where in this case, touch means to strike or to smite, and some translations read that way. Even though Job thought that God had turned his friends against him, perhaps there would be just one who would see how thoroughly God had punished him and would be willing to offer just a single drop of water in healing. When they don't respond to his pleas, he angrily turns on them in verse 22 by asking, "Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh?" Job may have thought back to the accusation his friend Bildad had made against him. Speaking of how the wicked are punished in chapter 18, particularly verse 9, a trap seizes him by the heel, a snare holds him fast. Verse 13, calamity eats away parts of his skin. Death's firstborn devours his limbs. And verse 18, he is driven from light into darkness and banished from the world. Now, he thinks that might be exactly what will happen to him. But Job just wants his friends to get some sense of what he's dealing with from his perspective, rather than telling him why he's got it so bad. If God's not going to step in to somehow relieve him of his pain and suffering, perhaps, maybe, just one of them would pause to take Job's words to heart, that he is a man of integrity, whose life has been an open book before God, and there are in fact no grounds of condemning him for his sin. It's enough that God has poured out his wrath on Job. They don't need to add anything to what he's already done. Instead, let just one of them at least say, "Job, my friend, perhaps you're right and sincere. Perhaps God has somehow misjudged your character. Let just one of you join me in my defense." But it was not to be. Instead, not only do they add their own persecution to the pain God has inflicted, they see themselves as God's agents of wrath. They assume a divine authority to carry out God's punishment on their own. Are they not satisfied with his flesh, like a wild beast who tears his neighbor to pieces, just as his friends have done with their words, passing judgment on him since his afflictions are due to nothing other than his own sin? Their words have torn him apart. They have, figuratively speaking, devoured his flesh through their false accusations, malicious slander, and unfounded claims against his character. And this has affected him emotionally even more than the pain he's experiencing from the boils that affect him physically. In spite of all his pleas, in the minds of his so-called friends, Job is wholly unworthy of any aid or comfort they could offer. So Job reaches out beyond his friends, beyond his family, to a generation yet unborn who will hear of his plight and have compassion on him when no one else will. He writes in verse 22, "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever." He had been charged with hypocrisy and his motives called into question. His solemn appeals and his arguments to defend his innocence have been cast aside. And in this state of mind, he expresses his earnest wish that his life story might somehow be permanently recorded so that others more compassionate and less judgmental than his friends would finally see the truth of his testimony and recognize the justice of his cause. He wishes that his words could be written on a scroll, or better yet, and more permanently, carved into stone with an iron pen, and then the engraved letters filled in with lead in order to make an indelible and lasting record. Archaeologists have found stone tablets that used this method that could date back to perhaps around the time Job may have lived. Job imagines a smooth cliff or a monolith rising from the desert floor with an inscription bearing the message that he, once the esteemed leading citizen of Uz, had been suddenly crushed by adversity, his children killed, his flock stolen, his body racked with pain, until in his suffering he died, still holding to his resounding conviction that everything that had befallen him was not the result of his own sin, for he had done no wrong to either God nor man. It would stand there for the next generation to judge him, and if they refused to exonerate him, perhaps the next generation or some generation following would finally find him innocent. But if past performance is any indicator of future success, there will be no hope for Job. As much as he would like for later students of his life to judge him more fairly than his contemporaries, there's no reason whatsoever to believe they would. Unless God would somehow intervene to justify him, to exonerate him, to vindicate him. And this is Job's ultimate hope. This is the hope, the confidence that emerges so boldly and so confidently from a life of faith, even in the midst of the worst circumstances of life that could be imagined. So, resigned to a state of hopelessness in the moment, he turns the hopeful eye of faith to the future and says in verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes behold, and not another. How my heart faints within me. At last, we heard a powerful word of hope from Job's lips. Finally, he speaks a wonderful message of confidence and faith and assurance that surpasses all his pain and suffering and goes far, far beyond the momentary afflictions of his time, to a time when there will be no more pain, no more sorrow, no more tears. If there is hope that at some future time he will be vindicated and his innocence confirmed, it will be because God, not man, in the present or in the future, but because God will redeem him. History is full of inscriptions, engravings, documents, and monuments passed down from great world leaders that threaten everything from plagues to national destruction if the writer's words are not heeded, and many of them appeal to the various false gods they worshipped. But their words were never heeded, and the promised wrath never came about. Job, however, makes his appeal to the one true God as he looks beyond this perishable world to an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. One commentator writes, so this Hebrew poet breathed into the wandering air of the desert that brave hope which afterwards, far beyond his thought, was in Israel to be fulfilled. Had he been exiled from Galilee? In Galilee was to be heard the voice that told of immortality and redemption. In order to find the beginning of the hope that Job now seizes upon, we need to go back to the very beginning of his story. What has he seen in his life? First and always, he has seen God. His life has recently been filled with the most unimaginable experiences, but he still honors the name of the Lord. He doesn't understand what's happened to him or why, but his faith has been steadfast through it all. Chapter 1, verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In chapter 2, verse 10, he says to his wife when she tells him to curse God and die, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Chapter 7, verse 7, remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. Chapter 12, verse 13, to God belong wisdom and power, counsel and understanding are his. Chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance. Chapter 14, verse 14, I will wait for my renewal to come. You will call, and I will answer you. You will long for the creature your hands have made. Chapter 16, verses 19 and 20. Even now, my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend. As my eyes pour out tears to God. And here, I know that my Redeemer lives. Job begins this wonderful profession of his faith by saying, I know. He proclaims his utmost confidence in what he's about to say. His friends might accuse him of hypocrisy. They might charge him with hiding his sins, and he might not be able to disprove anything they had said. But in what he declares with such rock-solid certainty and conviction, he will not budge. This is what he wanted to have recorded in the eternal ledger, carved into stone, so that the story might be passed down to future generations. If people were to hear about Job's fame and sufferings, if they should hear about the accusations made against him so harshly and unjustly, he wanted this testimony to be written down for all eternity, to make it crystal clear that he had unwavering confidence in God, that he was not an enemy of God, that he fully believed that God would somehow come forward to vindicate him, and he would once again be the friend of God. Job knew that his Redeemer lived. We find the idea of redemption very early in the Old Testament. In chapter 25 of the book of Leviticus, we read that a close relative may come to the aid of a suffering family member to buy back whatever the family member had sold, presumably to care for himself. Or a relative of someone who has had to sell himself into slavery might be bought back out of his slavery by a near relative. In the book of Ruth, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer who not only paid the redemption price for Ruth's farmland, but also took her to be his wife. In the Old Testament, God is often referred to as the Redeemer, who redeemed or ransomed or bought back his people from bondage in Egypt. We read in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, that the Lord told his people during their captivity there, I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. In Psalm 19, David proclaims the Lord as his rock and his Redeemer, as he prays that his words and the meditation of his heart might be pleasing in the sight of the Lord. In Isaiah chapter 41, verse 14, the Lord identifies himself as the Redeemer of Israel. In each of these references, God proves himself to be the one who will deliver his people from whatever situation they found themselves in by paying the ransom price to buy them back and restore them to himself. So very unlike the afterlife that he so pessimistically imagined, Job's Redeemer lives, and he is alive even now. This is a confident declaration of his complete, unwavering trust in God. He may be afflicted with a disease or a loss of property or be forsaken by his friends or persecuted by his foes. But if he can look up to heaven and say, I know that my Redeemer lives, his return to plead my case and deliver me from my afflictions is a sure thing. Even if it won't happen tomorrow, it's still a sure thing. If he can confidently declare by faith that this is where his eternal hope rests, he will have peace. And so it should be with us as well. My Redeemer lives, and he will stand. He will arise to stand up for his servant Job. This is not necessarily a reference to a future resurrection that Job might experience, although some see that in this verse. The simple meaning is that he will appear and present himself as the one who will vindicate my cause. He will stand in the latter day, or more appropriately translated, at last, afterward, after some period of time. However long he was to suffer, however lingering his pain and affliction were likely to be, he had the utmost confidence that God would finally, at some future time that will certainly come to pass, God will arise to vindicate him, and he would stand upon the earth. The Redeemer pledged to him by the relentless law of eternal justice that a time is yet to come, and when that time comes, the Redeemer will stand at last on the earth to vindicate and pardon and free every person who has placed his or her faith in this Redeemer, even as Job has. The word we have translated earth refers to the fine, dry crumbs of earth, and so some translations read, at the end he will stand on the dust. As Job uses the word elsewhere in this book, he speaks of it as the grave, the place where he will go when he dies. For example, in chapter 7, verse 21, Job says, I will soon lie down in the dust. You will search for me, but I will be no more. Even at this very early stage in God's salvation history, some believe that Job actually envisioned his Redeemer rising from the earth, the dust, the grave, and triumphing over death itself, as did our Lord in his victory over sin and death. Will this Redeemer come before Job dies? He apparently didn't think so, but even if his coming is delayed, he is sure that his Redeemer will come to his rescue. Verse 26, even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and with whom my eyes will see, and not another. How my heart faints within me. As his life slowly and painfully erodes away, as the disease process of the boils that encase his body comes to its eventual end, resulting in his death, as unsure is he about what exactly happens after his dead body is laid in the ground and what's left of his flesh decays in the ground, he is confident that he will see God. In spite of the fact that he believes that what remains of his flesh after the disease has run its course will itself be destroyed, he expects to see God in his flesh. Now, how exactly this would take place is a matter of great disagreement among biblical scholars, as you can imagine. Would Job be resurrected and clothed with a new physical body in the resurrection? Or does he believe that he will be given a spiritual body? As much as has been written about this, I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference, particularly from Job's limited perspective and the absence of further revelation that would come in the centuries to follow before Jesus came. We know of other biblical writers who expected to see God, including David, who wrote in Psalm 17, verse 15, and I, in righteousness I will see your face. When I awake, I will be satisfied with seeing your likeness. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, recorded by Matthew in chapter 5, verse 8, said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Job reaffirms his confidence in seeing the Lord for himself with his own eyes in verse 27. He won't hear about God's vindication of his righteousness from someone else. It will be a personal message delivered to him in person. He won't see God in some kind of vision or a dream, but, he insists, it will really and truly be God himself whom I behold with my eyes. There is an unmistakable tone of exultation and triumph that resonates from Job's heart here, especially when we hear him close the thought by saying, how my heart yearns within me. The more important question raised by verses 25 and 26 is, who is the Redeemer? Is it God who at some point in history intervenes on Job's behalf to establish his righteousness based on Job's faith? Or is the Redeemer the Messiah himself in complete fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where we hear God say that the serpent will bruise the heel of a certain descendant of Eve, while that descendant will himself crush the serpent's head and, in the process, provide the ransom for not only Job's sin, but the sins of the world. Here again, scholars disagree, primarily because we have so little information about how developed Job's understanding of God and his purposes in the world were at the time. Did Job have a basic understanding of and belief in the Messiah? And was that enough to lead us to believe that he was referring here to the Messiah? It's difficult for us in our day on this side of the cross to imagine how much Job knew that would have provided the necessary foundation for us to say his faith rested on a clear understanding of the Messiah and his mission to seek and to save those who are lost. Perhaps the words that would give us the most confidence in believing that Job was truly talking about the Messiah are found in this passage that begins back in verse 23 with Job's heartfelt wish that his words could be written down so that future generations would not only recognize the pain of his struggle, but that they would also recognize his faith in the hope that they too would place their faith in this Redeemer who would be the Messiah. However, it seems that Jewish scholars, even the most ancient, never applied this passage to the Messiah or to the resurrection, and few later scholars take this view either. Job's friends don't comment on his faith so clearly stated in these verses, and in the concluding chapters of the book, God neither confirms nor denies that he will raise up a Redeemer and resurrect Job. One eloquent 19th century commentator earnestly wishes it had been otherwise, writing, "I confess that I have never been so pained at any conclusion to which I have come in the interpretation of the Bible as in the case before us. I would like to have found a distinct prophecy of the Messiah in this ancient and venerable book. I would like to have found the faith of this eminent saint sustained by such a faith in his future advent and incarnation. I would like to have found evidence that this expectation had been incorporated in the piety of the early nations and was found even in Arabia. I would like to have found traces of the early belief of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, sustaining the souls of the patriarchs then, as it does ours now in triumph. But I cannot. Yet I can regard it as a most beautiful and triumphant expression of confidence in the living God, and as wholly worthy to be engraved, as Job desired it might be, in the solid rock forever, that the passing traveler might see and read it, or as worthy of the more permanent record which it has received by being printed in a book, by an art unknown then in Job's day, and sent down to the end of the world to be read and admired by all generations. It was an invaluable lesson to sufferers, showing them that confidence could and should be placed in God even in the severest trials. So far as I can see, all that is fairly implied in the passage, when properly interpreted, is fully met in the events recorded in the close of the book. So, however we might understand this passage, Job's confidence in God's perfect balance of mercy and justice is unmistakable and a powerful testimony of his faith, his absolute unwavering confidence that God will right all wrongs and restore Job to a right relationship with him, all in a manner and time of his choosing. And his confidence should be an example and inspiration for us as well, for we know far better than he of the finished work of the Messiah, whom we know as Jesus. In this confidence, Job then turns to his friends in verses 28 and 29 to say, "If you say, 'How shall we persecute him?' and 'What pretext for a case against him can we find?' then be afraid of the sword for yourselves, for wrath brings the judgment of the sword, so that you may know there is judgment." Instead of pleading with them to show pity on him, as we read just a few verses before in verse 21, Job seems to be filled with a renewed confidence that now turns the tables on his accuser friends. When Job's Redeemer arises and vindicates him from the false charges of his friends who said he was suffering because of his sins that he will not admit, then Job's Redeemer will become their judge. As surely as the Redeemer will vindicate the innocent, he will also punish the guilty. If his friends continue to badger him with their accusations, and if they persist in their attempts to fabricate charges against him with no basis in fact, they will see that Job's Redeemer will punish them with the sword being a picture of the judgment that will be carried out against them. If they had thought God was executing his wrath against Job for his sins through his afflictions, they needed to know that God's wrath would be far more severe for their slander and their blasphemy. As chapter 19 closes, we find Job's hope renewed and his confidence in God restored in spite of the very dismal picture he has painted for us in the opening words of the chapter. As the clouds of doubt and despair part and the sunlight of God's glory shines more brightly on his face, Job is able to see clearly to the everlasting hope of the work of his Redeemer, the one who will judge him fairly and honestly and restore him to a right relationship with God. Job's steadfast, unmovable confidence in how God works should bring us hope and encourage us to share that hope with those around us every day. Charles Wesley wrote a little-known hymn based on this passage, a part of which reads, "I know that my Redeemer lives and ever prays for me. A token of his love he gives, a pledge of liberty. I find him lifting up my head. He brings salvation near. His presence makes me free indeed, and he will soon appear. Thy love I soon expect to find in all its depth and height, to comprehend the eternal mind and grasp the infinite. When God is mine and I am his, of paradise possessed, I taste unutterable bliss and everlasting rest." This is the promise that Job, long before Christ, encourages us to rest in today. Well, thank you for being a part of our study of Job and his unfailing trust in our faithful God in spite of his tragic circumstances and the callous attacks of his friends. Next week, we jump ahead to chapter 28, verses 12 through 28, where we'll hear Job reflect on the greatness of God's wisdom and how we can gain that wisdom for our lives as well. May God bless you as you feast on his word today and throughout the week to come. As you reflect on the tragedies that came into Job's life and his response of authentic faith, may your relationship with the Lord grow stronger as you bless the name of the Lord, knowing that your Redeemer lives even now. And may others be encouraged by your confidence and your hope today. As always, as it's still a good thing to do, keep calm, trust in the Lord, and wash your hands. God bless you.